Welcome to Talks at Google. I'm Juliet Ehimuan. I'm the country manager for Google Nigeria. And I'm very privileged and honored to be speaking with our guest for today, Professor Pat Utomi.
Pleased to be able to join you.
So our theme for today is leadership and nation building. These are topics that Professor Utomi has been known to really share a lot of views about and be actively involved in. And but I'll start with just going through his profile. This is probably the shortest introduction you'll ever get for Professor Utomi. So Professor Utomi is a fellow of the Institute of Management Consultants of Nigeria and founding senior faculty of the Lagos Business School, Pan-Atlantic University. He was director of the Center for Applied Economics at the Lagos Business School. He has served in senior positions in government as an advisor to the President of Nigeria, the private sector, as Chief Operating Officer for Volkswagen of Nigeria, and in academia. He is the author of several management and public policy books, including the award-winning Managing Uncertainty, Competition and Strategy in Emerging Economies in 1998, and the 2006 book, Why Nations Are Poor. He has been a scholar in residence at the Harvard Business School and the American University in Washington, D.C. As leader of civil society, he is the founder of the Center for Values in Leadership, the Widow Support Center, and the Concerned Professionals, which was bulwark against military oppression, among numerous other social enterprise initiatives, and honored by so many professional bodies with a collection of more than 700 plaques that mark a life of service.
Actually, over 1,000 now.
Over 1,000 now. Professor Utomi, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I said this was a short version, didn't I?
Actually, I have a much shorter version. When I introduce myself, I say I'm a teacher.
At 60, which is the oldest person in the room right now, what do you know for sure about life?
Well, I know for sure that I don't know much about life. You know, every day you learn something new. The way things were yesterday and seemed right, they're wrong today. So life is pay as you go, learn as you go, adapt as you go.
Right.
But what's important about life is that you should be driven by some very basic principles that really never change, no matter how the world around you changes. When I was at university, I ran into something that was chasing me from when I was 7 years old. It's called the library. And instead of going to flying school, I went to graduate school. As a very young person, I was significantly shaped by a group of American Catholic priests in a very rural part of Nigeria, a place called Guzo in today's Zamfara state. And John F. Kennedy was president of the United States of America, first Catholic to be elected president. And so I was the guinea pig. Everything Kennedy said, I was made to read by these Catholic priests. And at 7, I began to love to read. I read quite a bit. I read books 20-something-year-olds were not even looking at that time. And out of a sense of duty, I was available most of the time, and since there was nothing else to do, I began to read all the books that were in the library. So that's how I changed my mind from flying school and started to correct. I don't want to tell you how I chose the subject I studied at the University of Nigeria. Well, I should say. I just closed my eye and put down the pencil. I said, whatever it touches, I'll just ask for. I'm not just going to spend a year or two there. So it was for play. And so the other interest I had to pursue in grad school, and that's how I ended up with those number of degrees.
Interesting.
Nothing.
So you said you put a pencil?
I just put down a pencil, so whatever this is, that's what I will feel in this form.
And do you feel it worked out okay?
In the end, it did work out okay. It did work out okay.
Fantastic. And in all of this, why did you decide to go into politics?
Because one basic thing has driven most of my adult life. How can I make the world around me better than I met it? How can I make it better, different? And I saw different ways of affecting the world around me, and that led me to the various things that I did. At a point in time, there was an overwhelming sense that you made the most difference in public life. I have a fairly different understanding of things right now. Sad to say, but I think that in some developing countries, Nigeria is a classic example, the nature of the triumph of politics makes political life actually more detrimental to progress than anything else. I believe that the government of Nigeria does more to prevent progress than to make it happen. Even though the goal is to make progress happen, but that the level of goal displacement in public life is so massive that in the end, government assaults property rights significantly because of the interests of those who have gone into those positions. Government is unable to quickly. I just came back from a tour of Australia as a guest of the government of Australia. And part of what I was suggesting to those that I met, including MPs, cabinet ministers, and you could make a greater difference by engaging the private sector, engaging social enterprise in a country like Nigeria than engaging the government of Nigeria. It's a sad conclusion to come to, but that is unfortunately the nature of the beast. But we can't stop trying. Obviously, you can make a significant difference if you get the right kinds of values, the right kinds of people in public life. But for now, government is significantly a source of holding back progress rather than making progress happen.
And you ran for presidency in 2007 and 2011. What do you think it would take for someone with your profile to be elected president in Nigeria?
Take an accident. There have been many accidents. With the power of the internet and all of that. I mean, the way the Obamas of this world emerged from what in that political system would have been thought impossible a few short years before that can also affect change here.
And talking about that change, so we hear an increasing number of young people wanting to get involved. And we hear there are two philosophies actually that we've heard about in the political space. One is that power is not given, it's taken. Another is that power is not a la carte, right? How can young people get a seat at the table when you have such ideologies around, you have to grab 100% of it, or it has to be bestowed upon you?
I think that organizing, politics has always been about organization. If young people organize, they can get rid of all those in power as they want, because we've got a youth bulge. The majority of the population is young. If they realize that their future is being really put at risk by the kinds of people who are in power, and they realize it stoutly enough, they can organize in a way that can help them get rid of those kinds of people. You're talking about power not being served a la carte or being taken. Many years ago, I was getting off an elevator at the Hilton in the Nigerian capital of Abuja, and a very powerful politician, Elijah Damuchiroma, who was finance minister, I think, at the time, and sees me and says, Pat, you have been complaining about things. Nobody gives you power. You have to take it. Force us out. And I thought, okay, he's got a point. And I've been trying very hard to get people to force them out since then.
So looking at the broad context of Nigeria, we're talking about leadership and nation building. And a lot of us see the greatness in our country, Nigeria. It's the country with the 7th largest population in the world. It's the largest economy in Africa. We've got entrepreneurial, resilient, and very, very talented people. A very high percentage of young people as well, and all of that energy. We have great weather, fertile soil, and abundance of natural resources. But there are some harsh realities as well. I mean, if we just look out the window at the NNPC filling station, there are long queues, fuel scarcity. And you also mentioned in your book that our poverty figures went from 35% to 45% in 10 years, right? How would you assess where we are today as a nation relative to the promise of Nigeria at independence?
The easiest way to compare is to look at countries that were peers. As an old Nigerian politician of great glamour, the that Masan in Kano, he's called Alhaji Maitama Sule. Anytime I run into him, he goes back to the fact that in the 50s, the countries that were expected to change the face of the world coming out of the developing or emerging countries were India, Brazil, Nigeria. And people didn't talk much about the South Koreas of this world back in those days, not to talk of the Malaysias, and those ones emerged as the frontiers countries of a world in which underdeveloped countries were emerging fairly quickly. Why did Nigeria, which held so much promise in the 50s, fall behind? A number of factors. One is what I call the unfortunate alchemy of soldiers and oil. Soldiers centralizing authority and oil making them not need the tax that people pay and therefore not bothering to be held accountable. This has worked against Nigeria in so many ways, in terms of the policy choices we've made and are still making. I mean, if you take 2 or 3 of the major crises of now, fuel queues, I mean, that is as basic as common sense can take anybody. And I'm willing to put a bet down that if Nigeria announced today that anybody who can refine petroleum products, anybody who wants to sell premium motor spirit from anywhere in the world, so long as they have a certain standard, is free to come into Nigeria and sell for whatever price. The prices will be lower than the government official price within the next year or so. But it will not be done because people are extracting rent from the process. This person in power, his people finish extracting rent, the other person comes, and it's always done in the name of protecting the common man, who is the victim continuously of these dirigist traditions. We did it with telecommunications. I have a story, slightly long, but a story on telecommunications. In 1996, I spent a year on sabbatical leave in the Boston area. I went at the Harvard Business School to write a book titled Managing Uncertainty, Competition and Strategy in Emerging Economies. Got in, rented a small house on a street called Elm Street in Cambridge. And I wanted to get a phone. And I thought, oh dear, how do I do that? I need to get to the telephone company. I went to the street corner, the telephone booth, called the phone company and said, I need to have your address so that I can come in and get a telephone. They said, but you don't need to come in to get a telephone. I said, oh, well, why not? So just give us your details, give us your last telephone number, and if it's okay, if it checks out okay, by tomorrow morning, if you pick up the phone in the house, you will get a dial tone and we'll give you your number. And back in those days, Nigeria has spent billions of dollars trying to provide telephones to its people, and less than 280,000 telephone lines were working in the entire country of more than 100 million people. And I thought, okay, those guys, I chose a long distance provider. Following morning, I pick up the phone, there's a dial tone, all right, and I begin to call. In somebody who's been denied access. Every night, I get on the phone as they're waking up in Lagos. Are the kids ready? Have they gone to school? So, end of the first month, I had a big bill. Second month, I had a big bill. Of course, I paid my bills as they came. And then one day, the phone's ringing. I thought, oh, what's happening in Lagos? I grabbed the phone. I said, this is Sprint, long distance provider. I said, yeah, any problem? I said, yeah, we noticed you've been making lots of phone calls. I said, yes. Is there any problem with that? I thought, I think this Nigerian is 419. He's calling Nigeria all the time or something. I said, no, not at all. Because you're such a good customer, we want to reduce your rate by half. I said, really? Yes, in fact, the first 2 months' bills that you've paid, we're going to give it to you as a welcome gift. So we'll deduct them from future. And I said, come. This is September. Father Christmas doesn't come till December. Tell me what the trick is here.
What's the catch?
Yeah. When I dropped the phone, I said to myself, dummy, 3 times. You came here to write a book on competition and strategy, and you see it and you can't recognize it. Because somebody is going to get hold of the fact that there's some fellow who's making so many phone calls and call me and offer me a better rate. And that's why the company I was using moved first. That's what's going to happen to this country if we did eventually with telecoms through the GSM process. Now, from 280-something thousand working phone lines, 120-something million. And so it's not rocket science. It's taking care of. Same thing with power. Somebody was joking with the minister from Nigeria. I didn't know he was a minister. He was West African on a flight from Accra, and says to this minister at the time, a friend of mine called Remi Babalola, says, "Sir, this problem you people have with electricity, tell me, is that you people don't know where they sell these things? I can introduce you to GE if you don't know where they sell these turbines." Power was solved, the problem was solved 100 years ago. The only reason we've spent billions of dollars and don't have power is simply because we are playing games with extracting rent from the system. As simple as that. And we can fix these things very easily if we have people who have the right mindset and have real commitment to the country.
So you paint, and I really want to touch on that in terms of, the way forward. You paint a very comprehensive picture in your book about the pivotal things that have happened since independence to get us to where we are. From things like having 30 years of military rule and the impact on federalism, undermining of institutions, institutionalized corruption, not effectively managing volatility in the upstream and downstream sectors of the oil industry, not diversifying our economy, a decline in agriculture, and things like that. Now, and we wouldn't be able to go into those in detail, but they're covered in a lot of great detail in the book. But thinking about the way forward and solutions, you proposed a growth drivers framework in your book that had 6 things: leadership, culture, institutions, policy choice, entrepreneurship, and human capital. See, I was paying attention.
Yeah, absolutely. It's amazing. Even I don't remember all of them.
So if we start with leadership, this is a big area of focus for you. And I believe you've said on occasions that part of our problem through the years has been a crisis in leadership. What type of leadership, in your opinion, is required to take Nigeria forward?
Well, leadership really is leadership, but there are leadership styles and approaches to leadership. Leadership, simply is about applying the self in a way that goal-directed behavior through influencing others is smoothened by the fact that you have knowledge, you have a sense of service towards people, you have a value frame that allows the people to see a shared motive in solution to certain kinds of problems that face them. Some cultures make the concept, the idea of the leader as a shepherd more attractive. If you look at Bible, for example, leadership images in the Bible, look at the shepherd, the steward, and the servant. Servant leadership model being essentially the one that Jesus offered. I advocate a model that I call the solicitor leader. And in many ways, Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela are closer to that model. People who, by the sheer force of their conviction, and the fact that, like solicitors, they engage the issues, and so you have to know a great deal to be a solicitor leader. People buy into and own their vision, and therefore there is a lower cost in mobilizing people towards achieving those broad objectives that are set. I think that where you have a significantly illiterate population, perhaps the shepherd leader model can be very attractive. If you have a great number of educated younger people, the solicitor leader model is probably more attractive. But sometimes you get a blend of these models, and I think that really we need, in many cases, solicitor leaders, in some cases, some shepherds. Unfortunately, there is a tendency to have this messiah desire. we're looking for a messiah. This man will come and save us. And it never quite happens like that for a variety of reasons. The US President Barack Obama, on his first visit to Africa, in his first speech in Accra in Ghana, made a very profound point, which unfortunately for me, I had been speaking to for years, but nobody listened to me until he said the same things. What Africa needs, strong institutions, not strong men. We're always looking for strong men who will be messiahs. And the problem with messiahs is that those who succeed them always want to undo what they have done, because the legitimacy of the new guy will not be achieved if that other person's legacy holds.
Yeah.
So we get into these recursive modes. Nigerian economy has been described as a recursive economy, 2 steps forwards, 4 steps backwards, essentially because of this strongman role. Because when a particular governor comes and he backs on all these projects, his successor is sure to abandon these projects and start new projects. You don't really build like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree with you about the solicitor model versus messiah, because, if you think about it, responsibility should exist at every level, right? But it also raises the question, from a very practical perspective, how do we go from, say there's a leader with the best intentions, right? There's still a need to create that rallying to a common vision and also influencing at every level, right? So how would we go from, maybe understanding of the issues, etc., to actual practical transformative action?
I am a great admirer of the Canadian writer Robin Sharma, who writes about the leader who had no title. If we are all educated to realizing that we are all leaders and that we all have a responsibility for the change that we seek, somebody being able to effectively articulate it helps us through patterns of socialization, agencies of socialization, whether it's the church, whether it's the school system, into a people who start by buying into a certain vision of the world. And I call this the pedagogy of the determined. And not to give myself too much credit for anything here, because I took it away from a Brazilian educator in the 60s and 70s called Paulo Freire. Paulo Freire was famous for a book on education that was titled The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And the pedagogy of the oppressed essentially looked at the mindset of oppressed people, colonized people, and the kind of education that they get, like a piggy bank, that enables them just make itsy bitty little progress within the context of their enslavement, if you will. But the people were trained to begin, first of all, by developing a certain vision of society. And then all the knowledge they seek is to move them towards that vision. But Paulo Freire was a Marxist. I have never been a Marxist, so I had a basic problem with the heavy ideology content from the beginning. So I took an entrepreneurship approach to the same idea of the pedagogy of the oppressed and say that people need to begin with a vision of the world they want to see and entrepreneurially craft what it is can move their world towards that location. And this is the, on this kind of platform, it's easy for a leader to mobilize these other leaders to channel society's energies towards a certain goal. And in some ways, if you look at what happened in South Korea, you will see that happen. There's a South Korean-born economist at Oxford called Ha-Ju Chang, who's written a very interesting book titled Bad Samaritans. And he essentially looks at the developmental state and tells the story of how South Korea got to where it is. And I believe that we need a developmental state orientation, but you need a different kind of set of leaders from the kind of people who we find in our country with massive levels of goal displacement, where self is so important. Whereas true leaders are self-sacrificing people. Leadership behavior is other-centered behavior. If you look in the mirror and what you see most of the time is me, myself, and I, you're not a leader. You need to, as you look in the mirror, ask how can this person touch other lives and make a difference. If you think that way, there's a pretty decent chance that you will make a leader. So I think it's important to bear these things in mind in how we challenge ourselves to how to move to where. And young people are easy to connect to this kind of thing. And that's why the future belongs to how we connect to a generation that is, in most of the things they do, they look for an aspirational track that they can hook onto.
Yeah.
If we have leaders that connect properly into that, they can drive a generation towards a different destination.
Right. I think that's very powerful. If you look in the mirror and all you see is me, myself, and I, then you're not a leader. I think that's very powerful. Okay, so we're still on the subject of leadership, Prof. And I'd like to bring this to a very personal level now. You've been involved in leadership positions in business and government. How would you critique yourself in your role in these sectors, and what, in your opinion, could have gone better?
One of the questions that you get asked every time by reporters is, if you had to leave, how would you do anything differently? 90% of the time I hear people say, no, I would never do anything differently. I would do everything differently. Because every new day I find a different way of doing something better than the way I did it yesterday. But in the various roles that I've played, some things have come through that I could have done in a way that if I had a chance to do it over. One of the challenges in industry, of course, I was a peculiar kind of player when I was in industry. When I got to work for Volkswagen in Nigeria, first day, I said if I had my way, I would scrap the business. And everybody went, this guy crazy? They just hired this guy and he says if he has this way, he will scrap the plant. It wasn't because I thought we shouldn't have business in that area. It was because I thought that was not the most effective way to play. Motor assembly business, where we're not so competitive, isn't where we should be playing. We should probably look at where we have comparative advantage, factor endowments that enable us build global value chains that we can significantly dominate. I recall in those early days, when I was saying these things and I was hammered by the media all around, a professor from Oxford called Paul Collier came to interview me because I was curious. And I said, look, if I had my way, I would get the government of Nigeria to sign agreements with Volkswagen, Daimler-Benz, Peugeot, and all the fellows who are producing or trying to do CKD operations here, to take a component that is based on some factor in which we were dominant players, like rubber, and become suppliers into the global supply chains of those companies for one or two components alone. First of all, we would create many more jobs in Nigeria. We would earn a lot more. In fact, at the point in time, I was, cocky enough to suggest that we would earn more from the rubber value chain if we added value than we're earning from crude oil. And I made a presentation at the first Nigerian Economic Summit on that in 1980. I don't know what. Shonekon's first year was 1993. That was the first economic summit. And I should have been more aggressive in that. I expressed it, and I kept saying, this guy, at a point I said, okay, I've had enough, I'm walking away from this. But if I had fought more strongly, and managers are not supposed to be head in this environment, on these kind of issues that are really big policy issues. Of course, I broke that rule, but I should have even broken it more. Because if I managed to educate enough people to understand the point I was making, then Nigeria will not be as far back as it is in manufacturing today. Good example is that Paul Collier, fast forward 25 years after, gets asked by UNIDO to study China's rapid advance in manufacturing and what Africa could learn from it. And when Paul Collier was done and shared his study, one of the things that came out was that China basically did what Pat Utomi was suggesting Nigeria do 25 years earlier. And Collier gives one example of it. There's a local government in China that manufactures nearly 75% of all the buttons worn on the planet. That was the whole idea, that if Nigeria became the dominant supplier of one or two rubber components in the motor car to production worldwide, Nigeria would be in a different sphere. Manufacturing would have risen dramatically in Nigeria. So, in many ways, I hold myself personally responsible for Nigeria's failure by not fighting harder to say this is the way to go. I let all these people with control ideas, just wear me down, and I walked away. That was a big error. Almost the same reason why I got into politics, actually, because I was part of this group called the Concerned Professionals, and we're professionals who fought the military, who were against the annulment of the fair elections of the 12th of June in 1993, right? And in the end, when the military abandoned, were running away after all that struggle, we thought, we're professionals. We should just go back to our businesses and let politicians take over. It's a big mistake. What happened was that the original politicians, the people who followed Awolowo, who followed Okbara, Azikiwe, Sardauna, were not sure that these soldiers really meant to go away. So they held back. And the bagmen of these soldiers, their contractors, became the new politicians. Nigeria has paid a very dear price for it. The deep corruption in our system came from the culture that they brought to politics. And when we realized what was going on, it was already late, because they came at a time of great boom. Oil prices had gone to over $100. They captured the state, extracted the resources of the state, made it theirs, and used it to erect a barrier into public life. Nigerian politics became about money, which they had stolen from the Nigerian state, and good people could not get into political life. So in 2005 or so, a group of us who said, no, we shouldn't go into politics, met, and we said, we made a mistake. Let's admit it to ourselves. That's how they said to me, run. At least let's use that to begin to define where Nigeria should be going.
Thank you for sharing those. And coming back to the growth drivers, entrepreneurship is another one you talk about. And I personally believe that homegrown entrepreneurship is very key to economic transformation. What excites you about the entrepreneurship space in Nigeria right now? We've seen growth in the entertainment industry, for example, particularly the music and Nollywood industries. We've seen virility in the technology entrepreneurship space. Yaba is fast becoming a hub for innovation. It's been dubbed the Silicon Valley of Nigeria. We've seen a growth in e-commerce, attracting foreign direct investment, and so on. What's your take on this space? Well, and you've been very involved you've been quite the entrepreneur as well yourself.
Well, I guess it started with my, I was so persuaded that was the way to go. That in the early days of the Lagos Business School, my colleagues and I had long battles over the place of entrepreneurship in our programs. The argument, which was reasonable, was that we were a general management institution. We should focus on general management. I argued that if Nigeria did not create an entrepreneurial culture, did not raise an enterprise class, we would not be what our promise is supposed to be. This went on until 1996. I think it was March 1996. A friend of mine, an African-American investment banker, Malcolm Pryor, who was a Wharton alum and was on the board of Wharton. I was visiting with him in Philadelphia, and I indicated an interest in meeting the dean at Wharton, and he set it up, and we both went to visit with the dean. And I talked about entrepreneurship in the course of conversation. He said, oh, we have a great center, the C. Snyder Center for Entrepreneurship. And the guy who runs it is an African. It's an African fellow at the time. And we went to visit. I saw cubicles where they were providing clinics for local Philadelphia businessmen. It was an opportunity for them to give back to the community much more than anything else. When I came back to Lagos, I so beat up on my colleagues that they gave up. So I designed and taught the first entrepreneurship class at the Lagos Business School. And that's how it all started. That seed eventually became what is called EDC today, Enterprise Development Center at the Lagos Business School. And in many ways, I therefore tried to stimulate entrepreneurship. Somehow, when, again, I went to a West African Enterprise Network meeting in 1993, I think it was, or so, and people from small West African countries had email addresses. We didn't have one in Nigeria because we were not on the internet. And I came in and challenged the class that I was teaching. And somebody from that class came to me afterwards and said, you know, we could work on something together. That's how LinkServe was born. And that's how Nigeria got on the internet, Nigeria's first ISP. So that developed, again, there are several other ones, but the one that I like, I romanticize really in my conversations is Nollywood. I used to argue that Nigeria would be more competitive selling its culture than selling crude oil. So there was so much in Nigerian culture that could be packaged properly and sold around the world. There was a romantic thing, literally, to talk about, but it didn't gain traction. Nobody paid any attention to it. So when I saw a group of out-of-work men and women pick up on old cameras and begin to make these videos, I got excited. And I began to offer, because I knew they couldn't afford it, I began to offer free seminars for them. On Saturdays, I'll come in and do a workshop free of charge. So this is a business. You got to organize yourself like a business. And so go back 20 years and you see Nigeria trying to rebase its economy and pointing to Nollywood. And I said, look at these people who all laughed at me 20 years ago. But it makes one feel good that one was part of a process like that. But the future going forward, I think, is going to depend very much. And I say this with respect for everybody. I think the repats, the young Nigerian men and women educated abroad who are coming home, will be the ultimate stimulant of the new economy. Because of the experience, the exposure they've had where they've been, and they come back. I think that entrepreneurial zest will drive them.
Great. And I agree with you that industries like our music industry and Nollywood are in many ways exporting aspects of the Nigerian culture and even financially putting that online, tapping into the export market.
Yeah. If I might just, it's not just that, as entrepreneurs, they will create wealth and all of that, but they are also agents of soft power for a country. A couple of years ago, some friends of mine, Nigerian doctors in California, who travel out every year to some African country on some goodwill initiative to offer free medical services, were in Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo. And it was election time. And all the billboards around the place was Kabila, Igwe, Kabila, Igwe. So one of them called me and said, you're not going to believe this. I'm in Kinshasa. And there are all these billboards, Kabila, Igwe. So I asked somebody, there's a Nigerian word like that is there any language group here that speaks that kind of? I said, no, it's from Nollywood. The big man in town is Igwe. So Kabila's campaign was Kabila, Igwe. I meant it was a couple, the Tito couple.
I'll just touch on two other growth drivers and then we can take questions from the audience. So still on one of the benefits of entrepreneurship is job creation, which is a huge challenge in Nigeria today. We know that unemployment figures are in the double digits. From your perspective and based on your experience, how do you think we can create jobs at scale?
Again, is the kind of areas of new enterprise that will determine what kinds of jobs we create. Nigeria is in a position to tap into the youth bulge to create a demographic dividend. What unfortunately has happened to us is that we've had a jobless growth economy. And this is for a variety of reasons. A lot of the growth has taken place, driven sometimes by oil, and has gone to a few people in what is a significantly diverging Gini measure, Gini index, the coefficient of income distribution. So a few people capture most of the wealth, and because they're really not truly entrepreneurs, the money just leaves the country. They're essentially extracting rent from the system. But if they were entrepreneurs and we are trying to create additional wealth, we would make a lot more progress. So if we encourage an enterprise class that, look at what Aliko Dangote has done in the number of jobs he has created. Mm-hmm. But you can do that even in tech economy, you can do that in other areas if a broader number of people were involved in enterprises that actually create wealth, not extract rent. So I think that we need to provide certain incentives for certain kinds of businesses that are based, again, factor endowments on which we can create value chains that are global. And each part of this country has a certain set of endowments which you can compete globally. Look at central Nigeria. Sesame seeds grow in the wild, literally. Imagine if you organize people and they have plantations of sesame seeds and they process and they supply to every McDonald's hamburger store in Europe from out of, they would earn millions and millions of dollars and they would create hundreds of thousands of jobs just on sesame seeds alone. You go to various areas. Nigeria has this long coastline of oil and gas assets. If you just said to everybody who wanted to sell the hydrocarbons value chain products, can establish, export, do whatever from there, you would create millions of jobs on the hydrocarbons value chain. So it has to be focused, it has to be targeted, and there have to be sets of incentives that encourage those kinds of investments. And government has to get out of the way. The more you can get government out of the way, the more likely it is that you can create these opportunities.
So I'm going to pause at this point and see if there are questions from the audience. I know a number of questions were submitted online. Just see if anyone in the room wants to raise a question before we go into what we have online.
Patito's gang, talking legacy, maybe that will ultimately be my legacy, because I get stopped at airports as far away as Los Angeles, LAX, and somebody's running up to me and says, excuse me, are you? And then I hear this Patito's gang story. Nigerians who now live around the world who said they grew up on Patito's gang. I feel good about that. But it was just about creating a marketplace of ideas. Unless a nation can get good quality conversation going, it will not create the ideas that it requires to get, that are acceptable, that everybody owns, to move forward. People don't know the kind of sacrifice I made to put that program up. When I produced, when we started, I wanted for it to be the best possible quality. In fact, the first director was American, who lived in Nigeria. And we had, in the then Director General immediate past Director General of NTA, Engineer Vincent Maduka saw me after the first 2 episodes and said to me, it's impossible to sustain that quality. We had roof shots, we had all kinds of, but wanted to do it well. And after 3 episodes, I get a call from a friend of mine, managing director of one of the more successful commercial banks in the country. And he says to me, oh, Pat, what a fantastic. He goes on and on and on. When he finished, I said to him, you know what? I'm glad you love it because we need commercial support for that thing to be on air. It's all part, but you guys speak the truth, and truth is not
lucrative.
I wouldn't want somebody to think that I'm putting you guys up to that speaking of the truth, But the day you will do sports, let me know. We'll pay twice as much. But that was part of the problem. Actually, the reason I could keep that show running for as long as I did, it was more than 10 years. It did come back after a 1-year break. It was on up till last year, second quarter of last year. But not with when it first started, it was on the NTA network, it was on channels, it was literally on every television network. And we paid, not only did we spend a lot of money to produce it, we paid those television stations to air them. That's the kind of business model we have. Instead of them to pay you for content, you pay to air. And the way that we were able to keep it on television going was we had the company that we set up had a big institutional advertising contract with a big multinational on something completely different that was called Leadership Reflections. But they paid us so well that the entire gain from that and more we had to fight for went into keeping that program. There was one particular year, it cost me literally 100 million naira to keep Patito's Gang on air. Wow. Advertising revenue, Nigerian companies were scared to advertise on a program that spoke truth to power. So you see how challenging it can be out there. So after many years, I had become literally bankrupt from trying to do service to the Nigerian people. And I thought, I got to stop this. And as soon as it stopped, everybody started complaining. So we had to try and get back. But yes, I'd be pleased to do another one.
And probably, because it sounds like a great output for the Center for Values in Leadership. And with the digital world today, right? Production costs don't have to be so high, etc. And there's more room for sharing and for people to help amplify that voice, etc. Yeah. So it's something that could be worth it. Online.
Yes.
Online.
Yes. And about being at the table, I talked to that earlier. You see, there's more than enough power in the hands of young people today, using social media and all of that, to just educate each other about the fact that this is not going to be accepted by us because you are the majority. 60% of those who will vote in the next election will be under the age of 30. Imagine if only 50% of those decide that this is the way we want to go. They can't stop you from being at the table if you organize. It's about organization. There was a book written in 1911, I think, on political parties. And political parties is about organization. Organization is about oligopolies. Who says organization essentially says oligarchy. The guy's name is Robert Michaels. Once political parties emerge, there will be oligarchies. A few people will control them. But if young people use current technology to build a different idea base, different ideology, they can send the nation traveling a different track. Now, about the guy who has all his money in dollars. First of all, there's so many foolish people in Nigeria because I consider it foolishness. You are developing other economies and starving your own country of oxygen. Maybe I'm foolish, but I don't have much. I tell people I don't have a room. Most people have several houses outside Nigeria. I don't have a room outside Nigeria. Almost every investment, just about, not almost, every investment I have is in Nigeria. I probably can find 20,000 pounds or something that I leave abroad just in case I can't send my children's school fees quickly enough from Nigerian banks. But I would never probably have much more than that outside Nigeria. For people who are not particularly wise, it might seem like something prestigious or something that they play safe with. But you know what happens? Most of them die and leave all that money because they are usually not man enough to even tell their wives that they have such money. So it is not wisdom, it's foolishness. That is said very often, but it's one of those lies that the system structures to, let people feed on. First of all, the Senate is a completely useless institution. It has no power whatsoever. Affects nothing, as far as I'm concerned, except the personal well-being of those there. If we need to restructure government, I would go to a unicameral legislature that is very small. Udoma, who is currently a minister, after serving in the Senate, when I was running for in 2006, said to me, the years I spent in the Senate were the biggest waste of my life. They do very little in terms of value add. This culture is a culture of executive. You have the strings, because all the people are looking for is the purse. If you can hold the purse strings, everybody comes bowing before you. And not knowing that you can use the instruments to do greater good, they focus on the power side. So I really don't believe in the legislature thing. It can be wonderful, legislature, but the way we are structured today, we contribute pretty little. If we return to a parliamentary, British, Westminster type system, then I would value the legislature. Right now, really, the only thing that matters is the executive branch. Judiciary can be very important if they do certain things to help the building of institutions. But you know the track, there is a different track. The other part of the question is about what I think of the way things are right now. I think that what has affected the way things are right now, same reason why the Ganifa Amis and Co. who ran is, how did we get here? Again, history often does not get written fairly or properly. From my experience in 2007, I was convinced that if Nigeria did not build a viable opposition, Nigeria was not going to get very far. If power does not go from one group in power today to another, if the opposition never defeats the incumbent regime, democracy will not be deepened in this country. And so my commitment from the beginning was in working with an opposition group to build a true opposition. In post-colonial Africa, there's a concept of the cooperative state, where the state tries to incorporate a strong voice of opposition. You get appointed a minister by people who don't like you so that they can keep you quiet. It's happened repeatedly in Africa. At some point in time during the Babangida years, the shortest cut to becoming Attorney General was becoming president of the Nigerian Bar Association, because the Bar Association used to give a lot of trouble to government. The shortest cut to becoming Minister of Health was president of the Nigerian Medical Association. As an example I like to give, and it's probably not fair to keep turning to him, a very strong leader of the NMA called Emmanuel Nsang became Minister of Health. And the government literally used him to destroy the NMA. And the day he was dropped from the cabinet, those who were close to him said he cried like a baby. He had nowhere to go back to. And nobody has ever since heard of him. So, many times that I've been asked to cabinet positions, the questions that I have always asked is, to do what? If you want me in a team, I want a certain critical mass of people who believe in something. And you must believe in a certain agenda that we all agree to before the journey starts. So, what you do see happening, is going on right now, is that I think we have a team that isn't even getting a hearing of the person who is leading. I think that most members of the cabinet will tell you that they don't agree with the policies that have left these petrol queues. They will tell you they don't agree with the policies that have created the mess in the foreign exchange market. They will tell you they don't agree with the policies that are affecting, very sadly, parts of the educational system and so on and so forth. But everybody is looking ineffectual because people haven't developed the culture of saying, I'm sorry, this is not what we agreed, I quit. But I think that that is very useful to send a signal to people who have authority.
Wow. Thank you very much, Prof. I know there are many questions. I do apologize. I also have a lot of questions, but we can't get to them because Prof has a lecture this afternoon, so we have to wrap up. But we can continue the conversation online. To wrap up, though, I'm just going to ask, what's the next chapter for you? What do the next 60 years look like?
This is going to sound a little corny because I keep telling people, young people, and it's the truth, that I had from very early. I had the good fortune of reading Stephen R. Covey very early in my life. And so I had a vision statement, I had a personal mission statement, I had all of those things. But I tell you, it's important to live it one day at a time. However, I think that, as I keep making this point, that Nigeria has a major public life challenge, and that is going to take individual effort to move Nigeria towards its destiny. I'm looking to play private roles that can have transformative impact in the economy. I look at Nigeria at a time when, given its general endowments, human particularly, and the possibilities, and Africa seen from the era of Afro-pessimism to one in which significant progress is expected, that private capital can come into this country from elsewhere if we can manage to do enough talking to get government out of the way and change not just infrastructure. Look, the Chinese have significant money that they have put aside to do industrial parks in Africa. Who is accessing those? There are infrastructure hubs developing out of Australia, and all of those. The private capital can come and do infrastructure. Nigeria has been talking about a second Niger bridge for forever. Bangladesh, one of the poorest countries in the world, is building several bridges and underground tunnel on the estuary. We need thinking people to engage as private, non-government actors in the international economic arena for our country. And I'm, in some ways, designating myself an unappointed ambassador in that area. And I hope that this will make some contribution.
Great. We could go on and on, but we'll continue the conversation online. Thank you so much, Prof.